The leather whip cracked against Cordelia's back with a sound that echoed off the wooden storefronts of Millhaven's Main Street. She stumbled forward, her wedding dress once ivory silk, now stained with dust and blood tearing at the seams. As she fell to her knees in the dirt, "Get up!" Silas Grimm's voice boomed above the murmurs of the gathered townspeople. "I paid good money for you, and you'll obey like the property you are." Cordelia's fingers dug into the hard-packed earth as she struggled to rise. 3 days. She'd been married to this brute for 3 days, and already the promises in his letters of a gentle home, a kind husband, a new life in the Oklahoma Territory had proven to be elaborate lies. The man who'd courted her with flowery words was a monster who viewed her as livestock. "Please," she whispered, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. "I only asked for water." The whip sang through the air again. This time, it never found its mark. A bronze hand shot out from the crowd, catching the leather cord mid-strike. The sudden tension jerked Silas forward, and he stumbled, his florid face twisting with rage as he turned to face his challenger. Standing before him was a Comanche warrior unlike any Cordelia had ever seen. Tall and lean, with obsidian hair braided with silver ornaments and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore traditional buckskins alongside a cavalry officer's blue jacket, the latter bearing lieutenant's bars that caught the afternoon sun. His presence commanded absolute silence from the gathered crowd. "You will release her," the warrior said, his English perfect but accented with the musical cadence of his native tongue. His voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of thunder. Silas sputtered, spittle flying from his lips. "Now see here, you red savage. This is between me and my wife. You got no business. I am Lieutenant Ayana, Mankiller of the 7th Cavalry," the warrior interrupted, his tone unchanged. "And you are beating a woman in the streets like a rabid dog. This makes it my business." The crowd shifted nervously. Everyone knew the treaty that had brought some Comanche to work alongside the army. But seeing one here in their quiet settlement, enforcing white man's law upon a white man, had upset the natural order they'd taken for granted. Silas's grip tightened on the whip handle. "I don't care what fancy uniform you're wearing. She's my property, bought and paid for, and I'll discipline her as I see fit." Ayana's expression never changed, but something deadly flickered in those storm-gray eyes. "No woman is property. This is the law of both my people and yours." He took a step closer, and despite being unarmed, his presence made Silas retreat. "You'll give her the divorce papers, or I will ensure you understand the error of your ways." "The hell I will." Silas raised the whip again, this time aiming for the warrior. Ayana moved like lightning. In one fluid motion, he caught Silas's wrist, twisted, and the whip fell harmlessly to the ground. The bigger man cried out as he found himself on his knees, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "Shoes," Ayana said simply. "Papers or consequences." The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though to Cordelia it felt like hours. Silas Grimm's face cycled through shades of red and purple as he weighed his options, his arm still trapped in Lieutenant Mankiller's iron grip. The gathered townspeople whispered among themselves, some arguing that the Indian had overstepped his bounds, others quietly admitting that Silas had finally met his match. Judge Cornelius Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his black robes billowing despite the still air. A thin man with wire spectacles and graying whiskers, he'd presided over Millhaven's legal matters for nearly 2 decades. "What's the meaning of this disturbance? This savage is interfering with a man's right to discipline his wife," Silas gasped, still on his knees. "Lieutenant Mankiller is within his authority," Judge Whitmore said after assessing the situation. He'd worked with the Comanche officer before and found him to be a man of uncommon integrity. Domestic disputes that spill into public become matters of civil order. Ayana released Silas, who scrambled backward, cradling his wrist. The warrior turned his attention to Cordelia, who remained on her knees in the dirt, trembling not from fear but from shock that anyone had intervened on her behalf. "Ma'am," he said, extending a calloused hand, "are you in need of medical attention?" She looked up at him. This strange guardian who'd appeared from nowhere. His face was angular and proud, marked with faint scars that spoke of battles fought and survived. But his eyes, those remarkable gray eyes, held only kindness. As he waited patiently for her response, I don't know, she managed, accepting his help to stand. Her legs felt unsteady, whether from the beating or the sudden hope blooming in her chest. She couldn't say. Dr. Penelope Ashworth, the town's only physician and one of the few women brave enough to practice medicine on the frontier, stepped forward. A stern woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and no patience for nonsense. She'd been watching the proceedings with growing disgust. Let me see those wounds, she commanded, already reaching for her medical bag. Silas Grimm, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, beating a woman half your size in front of God and everyone. Now see here. Doc, don't dock me, you brute. Dr. Ashworth's voice could have cut glass. I've been patching up your accidents for 3 days now. Bruised ribs, split lip, rope burns on her wrists. This isn't discipline, it's torture. The crowd murmured its agreement, and Silas found himself facing a wall of disapproving stares. In frontier communities, a man's reputation was everything, and his was crumbling by the moment. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. Given the circumstances and the testimony of Dr. Ashworth regarding ongoing abuse, I'm prepared to grant an immediate annulment of this marriage on grounds of cruelty. You can't do that, Silas protested. I paid her passage from Boston. I'm owed. You're owed nothing, Ayanna said quietly. And if you continue to protest, I will assume you prefer the consequences I mentioned. Something in the warrior's tone made Silas step back again. He'd heard stories about what happened to men who crossed the Comanche, stories that made him sleep poorly even in peacetime. Dr. Ashworth finished her preliminary examination of Cordelia's wounds. Nothing requiring surgery, but she needs rest and proper care. These welts will fester if not treated correctly. She can stay at the boarding house, offered Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, the widow who ran Millhaven's only respectable lodging establishment. No charge until she's back on her feet. Cordelia felt overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support from strangers in Boston. She'd had no one after her parents died, no family, no prospects, nothing but Silas's letters promising a new life. Now these people, most of whom she'd never spoken to, were offering help without expectation of return. That's very kind, she whispered. Judge Whitmore produced the necessary papers from his satchel. Sign here, Grimm, and we'll consider the matter closed. Silas hesitated, his small eyes darting between the judge, the warrior, and the increasingly hostile crowd. Finally, with a curse that made several ladies gasp, he scrawled his name across the documents. There, are you satisfied? He jabbed a finger at Ayanna. But this ain't over between us, Indian. Not by a long shot. The lieutenant's expression never changed. If you wish to continue this conversation, you know where to find me. 3 weeks later, Cordelia stood before the mirror in her small room at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. The bruises had faded from purple to yellow and finally to nothing. Her auburn hair, which had hung in lank strands during those first terrible days, now gleamed with health thanks to proper food and rest. Most importantly, the fear that had lived in her eyes since stepping off the stagecoach in Millhaven was gone, replaced by something that might have been hope. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Hartwell with the morning's breakfast tray. Instead, Lieutenant Ayanna Mankiller ducked through the doorframe, his cavalry hat tucked under one arm. In the weeks since her rescue, he'd checked on her recovery. Daily, always proper, always respectful, but never staying long enough for more than polite inquiries about her health. "Lieutenant," she said, suddenly self-conscious in her simple brown dress, "I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Cordelia." He'd never called her by her married name. Even during the brief time it had been legal. "But there's something we need to discuss." She gestured to the room's single chair while she perched on the edge of her bed. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled." Ayanna turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she'd noticed he made when choosing his words carefully. "Silas Grimm has been asking questions about you, about your legal status, your plans. He's also been drinking heavily and making threats." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that suggest he doesn't accept the annulment as final." Ayanna's gray eyes met hers directly. He believes that because he paid for your passage, you still belong to him in some way. This is not uncommon among men who see women as possessions, rather than people. Cordelia felt a familiar chill run down her spine. What are you suggesting I do? Leave Millhaven, he said without hesitation. There are opportunities for women with your education in Santa Fe, Denver, even San Francisco. You could start fresh, where no one knows your history. The practical part of her mind, the part that had survived her parents' deaths and poverty in Boston, agreed with his assessment. Running was the safe choice, the smart choice. But another part of her, a part that had been growing stronger during her weeks of recovery, rebelled against the idea. No, she said quietly. Ayanna blinked, clearly not having expected this response. Miss Cordelia, no, she repeated, rising from the bed. I've spent my entire life running from problems, hiding from difficulties, letting other people make decisions for me. That's how I ended up married to a monster I'd never met. I won't run anymore. This isn't about courage, Ayanna said, standing as well. This is about survival. Silas is dangerous, and he has friends, men who share his views about women and Indians. If he decides to take action, then we'll face it when it comes. She moved to the window, looking down at Millhaven's dusty Main Street. These people helped me when they had no reason to. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Ashworth, Judge Whitmore, even you. I won't repay that kindness by running at the first sign of trouble. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile as she gazed out the window. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something she'd never heard from him before: admiration. My grandmother always said that true strength isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She would have liked you. Cordelia turned from the window, surprised by the personal nature of his comment. In all their conversations, he'd never mentioned his family. Would have. She died 2 winters ago, during the final conflicts before the treaty. His expression grew distant. She was a healer, like Dr. Ashworth, spent her life caring for others, regardless of which side they fought on. The soldiers respected her for it. I'm sorry for your loss. She lived to see peace between our peoples, at least in this territory. That meant everything to her. He moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Cordelia, if you're determined to stay, then I ask one thing of you. What's that? Be careful. Silas isn't the only threat in this territory. There are those who resent the Comanche presence in Millhaven, who see our cooperation with the army as a betrayal of their beliefs. My association with you, your friendship, it could make you a target for reasons beyond Silas's personal grievances. She studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes, the careful way he held himself. Are you saying I should avoid your friendship to stay safe? I'm saying the choice should be yours, made with full knowledge of the risks. Without hesitation, she extended her hand to him. Then I choose friendship, Lieutenant, whatever the consequences. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond the boundaries of their different worlds. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, when the streets of Millhaven were empty except for the bakery's early rising owner and a handful of ranch hands nursing hangovers outside the saloon. Cordelia was in Mrs. Hartwell's kitchen, helping prepare breakfast for the boarding house guests when the first shot shattered the morning quiet. Get down, Mrs. Hartwell shouted, pushing Cordelia behind the heavy oak table as bullets splintered the window frame. Above their heads, through the chaos, Cordelia could hear Silas Grimm's voice bellowing orders to his companions. Burn them. Out if you have to. That Indian-loving whore belongs to me. The kitchen door burst open and Dr. Ashworth stumbled in, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. They've got the street blocked off, she gasped. At least 6 men, all armed. Judge Whitmore's barricaded in his office, but they're concentrating. Their fire here. Why? Cordelia whispered, though she already knew the answer. Because they know Lieutenant Mankiller visits you daily, Mrs. Hartwell said grimly. This isn't just about Silas's wounded pride anymore. Word is some of the ranchers have decided that the Comanche presence in town sets a dangerous precedent. They're using your situation as an excuse to drive him out. Another volley of shots peppered the boarding house's front wall. Cordelia could Here would splintering and glass breaking as windows throughout the building were systematically destroyed. The message was clear: surrender or burn. Miss Cordelia, Silas's voice carried over the gunfire. You come out now, and we'll make this quick. Keep hiding behind that Redskins' protection, and everyone in that building dies. Dr. Ashworth was wrapping her head wound with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. Where's the lieutenant? He should have heard the shooting by now. Scout. Patrol, Mrs. Hartwell replied. Left yesterday with a detachment to investigate reports of cattle rustling near the creek. Won't be back until evening. Cordelia closed her eyes, understanding the terrible timing. Silas had waited until Ayanna was gone, until she was isolated and vulnerable. The coward had planned this carefully. I have to go out there, she said. Starting to rise. Absolutely not. Dr. Ashworth grabbed her arm. That's exactly what they want. The moment you show yourself, you're dead, and probably the rest of us too, just to eliminate witnesses. But if you don't, we find another way. Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd survived 2 decades. On the frontier, Prudence Hartwell didn't build this establishment just to hand it over to a pack of drunken bullies. The older woman crawled to a cabinet and withdrew a rifle that looked well-maintained and frequentable. Why used? Dr. Ashworth, you still carry that pepperbox pistol? Never leave home without it. The physician produced a compact but deadly-looking weapon from her medical bag. Good. Cordelia, can you shoot? My father taught me, but it's been years. It comes back quickly. Mrs. Hartwell handed her a shotgun. Point, squeeze. Don't think too much about it. The 3 women took positions at different windows, careful to stay low and use the solid walls for protection. From her position, Cordelia could see Silas and 5 other men spread across the street, using water troughs and hitching posts for cover. They were clearly waiting for something, reinforcements, perhaps, or simply the right moment to make their final assault. Cordelia done. Silas called again. You got 1 minute to show yourself, or we start lighting torches. She glanced at Mrs. Hartwell, who shook her head grimly. Empty threat. Fire would spread too quickly in this wind. Half the town would burn, including businesses owned by men who'd hang him for the loss. But even as she spoke, one of Silas's companions was indeed preparing a torch, wrapping oil-soaked rags around a piece of wood. Maybe Silas was desperate enough to risk burning down half of Millhaven to get what he wanted. That's when they heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Lieutenant Ayanna Mankiller appeared at the far end of the street like an avenging spirit, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. He'd ridden hard and fast, somehow having learned of the situation, despite being miles away on patrol. Behind him rode 3 other Comanche warriors and 2 cavalry soldiers, a mixed force that represented everything the attackers claimed to oppose. Silas Grimm. Ayanna's voice carried clearly over the sudden quiet. Release the women and surrender. Yourselves to custody. Go to hell, Indian. Silas raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Ayanna had thrown himself from his still-moving horse, rolled behind a water trough, and come up with his own weapon ready. The battle was about to begin in earnest. The gunfight that followed lasted less than 5 minutes, but felt like a lifetime. Ayanna's mixed force of cavalry and Comanche warriors moved with practiced precision, flanking Silas's group from multiple directions while maintaining disciplined fire. The attackers, emboldened by liquor and righteousness but lacking military training, quickly found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Cordelia watched from the boarding house window as Ayanna advanced methodically down the street, using doorways and water troughs for cover, his movements fluid and purposeful. She'd seen him as a gentleman, a protector, a man of quiet dignity, but now she witnessed another side of him, the warrior he'd been trained to be from birth. 2 of Silas's companions threw down their weapons and surrendered when they realized their position was hopeless. A 3rd tried to flee and was brought down by a precise shot to the leg from one of the cavalry soldiers. The 4th, a grizzled rancher named Dutch Morrison, decided to make his last stand from behind an overturned wagon. This ain't over, Morrison shouted, firing wildly at Ayanna's position. We won't let you savages take over our town. Your town? Came a new voice from the steps of the bank. Judge Whitmore had emerged from his office, his black robes somehow still immaculate despite the chaos. Behind him stood Sheriff Bartholomew Knox, who'd finally arrived from his morning rounds at the surrounding ranches. The sheriff, a competent if unimaginative man, looked deeply embarrassed by the situation. "Dutch Morrison," Judge Whitmore continued, "your family has been in this territory for exactly 3 years. Lieutenant Mankiller's people have been here for 3 centuries. If anyone has a claim to call this place home, I'd say it's him." Morrison's response was another wild shot that splintered the judge's doorframe. Bad mistake. Sheriff Knox, who had infinite patience for drunks and minor disputes, but none whatsoever for anyone who shot at judges, ended Morrison's resistance with 2 precise rifle shots that left only Silas, who'd retreated behind the blacksmith shop and was now cornered with nowhere to run. He still had ammunition and desperation, which made him dangerous despite his hopeless position. "Cordelia," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, "this is all your fault. If you'd just been the obedient wife you were supposed to be, she owes you nothing," Ayanna called back, having worked his way to within 30 yards of Silas's position. "You have one chance to surrender peacefully." "Surrender to you?" Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I'd rather die than take orders from a red-skinned dog." "That can be arranged." The voice came from directly behind Silas. He spun around to find himself face to face with Dakota, one of Ayanna's fellow warriors, who'd managed to circle around the blacksmith shop undetected. The young Comanche held a knife at Silas's throat, having moved as silently as his namesake the word meant, friend to all in his language, though his enemies rarely lived long enough to appreciate the irony. "Drop the rifle," Dakota said calmly, "or find out how quickly a man can bleed." Silas's weapon clattered to the ground. Moments later, Sheriff Knox was fastening shackles round his wrists, while reading a list of charges that would likely keep him in territorial prison for the remainder of his natural life. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, Cordelia finally emerged from the boarding house. The street looked like a war's own broken glass, splintered wood, and bullet holes marked the intensity of the brief battle. But it was over, truly over, and she was still alive and free. Ayanna approached her slowly, his rifle now slung across his back, his storm-gray eyes searching her face for signs of injury or trauma. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, then looked around at the damage. "But others might have been." "All because of me." "No," his voice was firm. "All because some men cannot accept that their world is changing. You were simply the excuse they used to justify their hatred." He paused, considering his words. "There will likely be more incidents like this, Cordelia. My presence in this town, our friendship, it challenges ideas that some people would rather die than change." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the concern in his eyes, close enough to notice that his hands were trembling slightly from the aftermath of battle. "Are you trying to convince me to leave again?" "I'm trying to give you all the information you need to make your choice freely." "Then here's my choice." She reached out and took one of his shaking hands in both of hers. "I choose to stay. I choose to face whatever comes next. And I choose to stop pretending that what I feel for you is simple friendship." His eyes widened slightly. Round them, the townspeople continued cleaning up the debris and tending to the wounded. But for that moment, they might have been alone in the world. "Cordelia," he said quietly, "you know the challenges we would face. I know that you risked your life to save mine. I know that you've shown me more kindness and respect than any man ever has. I know that when I think about my future, I can't imagine it without you." She squeezed his hand. "The rest we'll figure out together." For the first time since she'd known him, Lieutenant Ayanna Mankiller truly smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. The wedding of Cordelia Dunn and Lieutenant Ayanna Mankiller took place 6 months later on a crisp October morning, with golden leaves falling like confetti around the small gathering assembled outside Judge Whitmore's courthouse. It was not the grand church ceremony Cordelia had once imagined for herself, nor the traditional Comanche ritual that would have been Ayanna's preference, but rather something entirely new, a joining of 2 worlds that reflected the couple themselves. Judge Whitmore, resplendent in his finest robes, officiated with a blend of territorial law and carefully researched Comanche customs. Having spent weeks consulting with tribal elders to ensure the ceremony honored both traditions, Dr. Ashworth stood as Cordelia's witness, while Dakota, who'd become Ayanna's closest friend among his fellow warriors, served in the same capacity for the groom. The guest list was small, but meaningful. Mrs. Hartwell had closed the boarding house for the day to attend, bringing with her a cake that was already legendary among Millhaven's residents. Sheriff Knox stood beside several cavalry officers, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the traditional dress worn by the handful of Comanche witnesses who'd ridden in from the reservation. Mayor Josiah Fletcher, initially reluctant to attend what some townspeople viewed as a controversial union, had been shamed into participation by his wife, who'd threatened to make his life miserable if he didn't support that sweet girl who'd been through so much. But perhaps the most significant witness was Standing Bear, Ayanna's grandfather and one of the most respected elders of their band. The old warrior had initially opposed the match not from prejudice, but from concern that his grandson would face impossible challenges in the white world. It was only after meeting Cordelia, speaking with her at length through Ayanna's translation, that he'd given his blessing. She has the heart of a warrior, he'd told his grandson in their native tongue, and warriors choose their battles wisely, but fight them to the end. As Cordelia walked toward the makeshift altar, in her simple blue dress she'd refused anything elaborate, preferring something practical she could wear again. She caught sight of Ayanna waiting for her. He wore his cavalry uniform with its lieutenant's bars gleaming, but over it he'd draped a magnificent buffalo hide vest decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of his lineage. It was a statement of identity, a declaration that he would not hide who he was for anyone's comfort. Their eyes met, and she felt the same flutter in her chest that had been growing stronger each day since the street battle. They'd spent the intervening months getting to know each other properly, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals building something together. She'd learned about his childhood on the plains, his education at the Carlisle Indian School, his complicated feelings about serving in an army that had once fought his people. He'd discovered her love of books and learning, her dry sense of humor, her determination to build a medical clinic for the growing town's women and children. "We are gathered here today," Judge Whitmore began, "to witness the joining of two remarkable individuals who represent the best hopes for our territory's future, where differences are celebrated rather than feared, where courage and love triumph over prejudice and hatred." The ceremony proceeded without incident, though Cordelia noticed several townspeople watching from doorways and windows. Not all the observers seemed hostile. Many appeared simply curious about this unprecedented union. Change, she reflected, often began with curiosity. When it came time for vows, they decided to speak from the heart rather than recite traditional words. Ayanna went first, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Cordelia, you came to this place as a stranger, fleeing one life and hoping for another. In finding your courage, you helped me find mine. I promise to stand with you against whatever challenges we face, to honor both your dreams and your independence, and to build with you a life that serves as a bridge between our peoples." Her own vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "Ayanna, you showed me that strength isn't about avoiding fear, but about acting with honor despite it. You've given me the gift of seeing myself as worthy of respect and love. I promise to support your service to both your nations, to face our future with the same courage you've shown me, and to love you with all the strength of my recovered heart." Judge Whitmore pronounced them married under the laws of the Oklahoma Territory, while Standing Bear spoke a traditional Comanche blessing that asked the spirits to guide their path together. As they kissed for the first time as husband and wife, applause broke out from the assembled witnesses, tentative at first, then growing in volume and enthusiasm. The reception that followed was held in the boarding house's main hall, with Mrs. Hartwell's legendary cake as the centerpiece and Dr. Ashworth providing musical entertainment. On her surprisingly skillful fiddle, cavalry officers mingled with Comanche warriors. Townspeople shared tables with tribal elders, and for a few precious hours, Millhaven felt like the harmonious community its founders had envisioned. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Cordelia and Ayanna walked hand in hand down the main street where they'd first met. The bullet holes from the battle 6 months earlier had been repaired, the broken windows replaced, but the memory of that day remained not as a trauma, but as the moment when they'd both chosen to fight for something better. Any regrets? Ayanna asked as they paused outside the spot where she'd once knelt bleeding in the dust. Only one, she replied with a smile. I wish your grandmother could have been here to see this day. He was quiet for a moment, then smiled back. Who says she wasn't? 5 years later, Dr. Cordelia Mankiller stood in the doorway of her medical clinic, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old son, Little Wolf, how to braid leather cord. The clinic, built with funds raised by the entire community, served patients from 3 different tribes as well as white settlers from across the territory. It had taken 2 years of careful negotiation and compromise, but it now stood as a symbol of what cooperation could achieve. The intervening years hadn't been easy. There had been other incidents: drunken cowboys who thought they could intimidate an Indian lover, bureaucrats from the territorial capital who questioned Ayanna's fitness to serve as a cavalry officer, and tribal members from both sides who viewed their mixed marriage with suspicion. But they'd weathered each challenge together, building not just a marriage, but a small revolution in how their community thought about difference and belonging. Ayanna had risen to the rank of captain and now commanded a mixed unit of cavalry and tribal scouts that was renowned throughout the territory for its effectiveness and discipline. His men, both white and Comanche, respected him not because of his heritage, but because of his competence and fairness. The unit had become a model for other frontier posts, proof that integration could work when approached with wisdom and good faith. Cordelia's medical practice had grown beyond her wildest dreams. She'd been joined by 2 other physicians, Dr. Rebecca Steinberg, a Jewish doctor fleeing prejudice in the East, and Dr. James Crowfeather, a Cherokee who'd trained at Harvard Medical School before returning to serve his people. Together, they provided care that transcended the racial and cultural boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable. Their son, with his mother's auburn hair and his father's storm gray eyes, was growing up as a true child of the frontier, equally comfortable speaking English, Comanche, and Cherokee, equally at home in cavalry barracks and traditional lodges. He was proof of the possibility they'd fought to create, a living bridge between worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Mama, Little Wolf called, holding up his completed braid. Look what Papa taught me. Beautiful work, she said, kneeling down to examine his handiwork. Your grandfather, standing bare, would be proud. The old warrior had died 2 winters earlier, but not before seeing his great-grandson take his first steps and speak his first words in the old language. His final blessing had been for the boy to grow up strong in both worlds, carrying forward the best of each tradition. A rider approached down the main street, not unusual in itself, but this one wore the uniform of a territorial marshal and rode with the urgency of important news. He dismounted at the clinic steps, touching his hat respectfully to Cordelia before addressing Ayanna. Captain Mankiller, Marshal Thompson sends word from the capital. Congress has passed the Enabling Act. Oklahoma's going to be a state within the year. Cordelia felt a flutter of mixed emotions. Statehood would bring opportunities, better funding for schools and hospitals, improved infrastructure, greater protection under federal law. But it would also bring increased scrutiny of arrangements like theirs, potentially more resistance to the integration they'd worked so hard to achieve. Ayanna thanked the messenger and walked over to where she stood. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about choice, she said, watching Little Wolf play with his leather braid. 5 years ago, I had to choose between running away from problems or staying to face them. Now we might have to make that choice again, but as a family. And she looked at the clinic behind them, at the mixed group of patients waiting in the outer room, at the town that had become their home despite all the challenges. I'm thinking that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. He nodded, understanding passing between them as it had that day in Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house. Then we stay, we build, we show them what's possible, together, she agreed. As if to underscore their decision, Judge Whitmore emerged from the courthouse across the street, his newest challenge in tow, a young Chinese woman who'd arrived on the morning stagecoach, fleeing an arranged marriage in San Francisco. Behind her walked Mrs. Hartwell, already making plans to provide temporary shelter, and Dr. Ashworth, assessing whether medical attention was needed. Cordelia smiled, recognizing the familiar pattern. Every few months, it seemed, someone new arrived. In Millhaven, seeking a fresh start, a second chance, a place to become something more than their past had allowed. And every time, the community that had once been divided by fear and prejudice found a way to open its doors. A little wider, Captain Mankiller, the young woman said shyly, approaching with Judge Whitmore. "I am May Lynn. They tell me you and your wife help people like me, people who need protection from those who would treat them as property."